All right. Hey, Kate, how are you?
Hey, I'm well.
All right. So we've got people joining right now. We are so thankful that you are here with us today. And for those joining you, in case you don't know how we were honored with this privilege, we participated in a challenge with Beanstack, our reading tracking app. And we had our community rally together and read as many minutes as they could for the month of February. And we were one of the top 5 libraries in the country that were picked to win a prize. And our prize is a visit with author Kate Winkler Dawson. So we are so proud of our community, and we are so happy with our partnership with Beanstack, and we are so happy to have you here tonight. So thank you for joining us.
I'm happy to be here too. It's fantastic. Thanks so much for bringing me on here. I wish I could be there in person. Bring me in person next time.
Yes, next time, your next book,
I
we'll have
love
you in
Colorado.
person. So I want to let people know a little bit about you. I've been researching you for months and know that
Oh
you went
no.
to the University of Texas. I've been
Yeah.
following your podcasts and reading up on your books and just really love what you're putting out there. But for those of you that don't know, so with almost 25 years in television news, Kate Winkler Dawson has worked as a field producer, a line producer, and writer for some of the top news organizations in the country. Her career started in Austin as an editor and associate producer at KVUE 24, and then as a producer at KEYE 42. And while earning her BS in broadcast journalism at Boston University, Dawson worked as a freelance political field producer for WLVI in Boston. She was instrumental in their coverage of the 1996 New Hampshire presidential primaries. She spent 6 months in London during her final semester at BU as a reporter for the United Press International Wire Service. After graduation, CBS's flagship station, WCBS in New York, hired Dawson as a writer and field producer. She was a freelance producer there for more than 5 years. Dawson also spent 2 years as a freelance producer, off-air reporter for ABC Network News Radio, and 4 years as a freelance show producer for Fox News Channel in New York, producing several of the network's top-ranked shows. She headed Fox News Channel's San Francisco bureau for 2 years as their staff field producer, traveling all over the country for national news stories. Dawson also holds an MS degree in journalism from Columbia University and was on the faculty at Fordham University's Journalism School in New York for 2 years, where she was the faculty advisor for one of the student newspapers. Dawson's foray into documentaries began in the spring of 2000 with her first film, La Candelaria. Since then, her credits include co-director, co-producer of GoldRush.com, aired on ABC's Nightline, Breaking the Barrier, screened at more than 10 film festivals worldwide, and Brass Ceiling, released theatrically for a short run at New York's Two Boot Theater. The Long Haul premiered at the 2008 San Francisco Documentary Film Festival. Dawson has taught at UT in the broadcast journalism department for almost 9 years. And before that, she was on the faculty at Marymount College at Fordham University in Tarrytown, New York. There, she supervised one of the campus newspapers while teaching journalism and English literature courses. And for 3 years, she was the faculty advisor for the new ABC News on Campus, a digital news bureau for college students at the University of Texas. Dawson wrote the book The Digital Reporter, released in 2014 by Kendall Hunt Publishing. Her debut nonfiction narrative, Death in the Air, the true story of a serial killer, London's Great Smog and the Strangling of a City in 2017. We do have that in the library system.
Yay.
And it has been optioned for television development. And her second book, American Sherlock, which you all have read, talking about the murder forensics and the birth of American CSI, has been optioned by Netflix for a TV series development, which I'm super excited about. She is the host and creator of the historical true crime podcast, Tenfold More Wicked, and it is on the award-winning Exactly Right network. I have been listening to that for weeks, and if you have not tuned into that, you definitely should. I highly recommend it. So without further ado, Kate, the screen is yours. Thank you again so much for coming. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. So Jamie and I talked a little bit about the format that I'm just going to talk for about 15 minutes or so. about how I found Edward Oscar Heinrich, and then we can just chat. This is a pretty small group, which is great, and we can, just chat, and you guys can ask questions or give me comments, or I'll ask you probably a few questions also. Since this is a book full of mysteries, I'll be curious about who thinks what about which crime. So I have an interest in forensics because of my dad, who was a law professor at the University of Texas in Austin for 37 years until he died in 2005. And I moved back here. As he was in the process of dying, I moved back, and I just never left Austin. I'm from here originally. And then I started teaching at UT in the journalism school. And my dad was a criminal law professor who started the Innocence Project at UT Law. So we talked about junk science and forensics all the time. We also, talked about wrongful convictions, which plays into my first book, Death in the Air. But, you know, Death in the Air, just kind of going back to how I ended up with Oscar Heinrich. Death in the Air was about one really big event, the London smog of 1952. And all of these people, real people who were stuck in it. So there's like a little girl, there's a doctor, there's a serial killer. Everybody's trapped in this smog. So it's one big event told through the lenses of multiple people. So for the second book, I really wanted to do sort of the reverse. I wanted one lens, Oscar Heinrich, a forensic scientist, and a lot of cases told through his point of view. And I was hoping we would be able to use the cases to create kind of an arc of his life. So, we are learning about his story alongside the cases, and the cases span from about 1920 until 1933. But his career trajectory was huge. It was sort of 1910 to when he died in 1953. The challenge for me was the lens. Who was going to provide this lens for me? I really wanted to do a book on forensics. The first book, Death in the Air, was a lot about air pollution. I tend to gravitate towards science, even though I really don't like science very much, which is sort of strange. Now I'm embracing it a lot more, but I just keep gravitating toward it. I think maybe science is intimidating to me. Air pollution was certainly intimidating. And then I, of course, jump into forensic science, which is very complicated in some circumstances. So, but I really did want to do forensics. And then I needed to find the right person. And I have a book that I keep at my house. It's like sort of embarrassing. It's an encyclopedia of criminals in America from the Mayflower until the book was published, which was in the 1970s, which is great because I really am not interested in contemporary crime at all. So I started flipping through this book when I was looking for American Sherlock, looking for the next book to do. And there's this big, on page 100, there's this like big spread on the Siskiyou train robbery. So if you all have read the book, you know that this train robbery was really the big thing that put Heinrich on the map. People had known who he was before because of Fatty Arbuckle and of Father Heslin and those cases, but this Siskiyou train robbery was a huge deal. It was international news, dramatic photos. Three would-be train robbers who actually never robbed the train. They blew up everything they could have taken, and now murderers on the run. And, you have these federal agents coming in and saying, we've literally used a fine-tooth comb on this pair of overalls and we can't find anything. And, he comes in and picks out 20 to 30 different items just because of who he is and the way he's been trained. That's all in this book that I started reading, and I saw the moniker America's Sherlock Holmes and thought, this is the guy. So the next thing on a checklist for me on whether or not I want to do a book on someone is, what does the archive look like? So what do I have to work with? I just will never be someone who can only work with newspaper articles because, number one, they're inaccurate much of the time, especially the earlier in America we go, the more inaccurate they seem to be. I mean, Oscar's name was spelled, there were probably 12 iterations of the way his name was spelled. And sometimes it was E.O. Heinrich, and sometimes it was Edward, and sometimes it was Oscar. It was all a big mess. And so, there's this pivotal part in the book that if you read it, you absolutely remember, which is when he loses his father when he's a teenager. I did not find out about that, about his father taking his own life, until about a week before the book was due to my editor because they had misspelled his name. I could not, I mean, I'm on newspapers.com doing searches. And I had been searching. I mean, that's really what I do at 3 in the morning is I'm on newspapers.com trying to find any kind of information that can lead me somewhere else. And they spelled Oscar's name wrong, and the Spokane, Washington newspaper that I had always looked at. And they spelled it incorrectly, and that's when I found out because they would report on everything in the late 1800s in the newspapers. So they reported on um, August Heinrich's suicide attempt, and subsequently how he was found. And it went into pretty good detail, and so it was enough for me to put into the book. But it was very frustrating, when you're trying to find sources. That's one source of frustration I have, is inaccuracies in newspapers. So I wanted to know before I was going to write this book what the archive was like, and that's what led me to UC Berkeley. So if any of you all are researchers or you enjoy doing research, probably you're familiar with worldcat.org. If you just go to worldcat.org and put in like my name, it'll show the books that I've written and where you can find them. So almost every book on creation is at the UT Library, University of Texas Library, where I work, which is fantastic. But it shows libraries all over the world where things are located. So I put in Oscar's name and up pops UC Berkeley because they are the university that has his collection. So when Oscar died, his son, Mortimer, I guess, they held on to his lab for a few years, and then they sold the house in Berkeley Hills. And because Oscar's taught at UC Berkeley for so long, I think Mortimer just assumed this would be the best place to put all of his stuff. So he sort of dumped everything at UC Berkeley's doorstep because it was completely disorganized with loaded guns. If you read in the prologue, there's loaded guns in different places. And so I thought I had hit, the jackpot when I saw this on WorldCat, that there were more than 100 boxes available to a researcher. The problem was the whole collection was closed because there were so many boxes. They didn't have an archivist available to catalog anything. So I had to petition UC Berkeley to allow me to come in once they cataloged things. And I just said, this guy was amazing. He was an incredible forensic scientist. Nobody knows anything about him. Someone subsequently has made a Wikipedia page about him, which is great. But he didn't even have a Wikipedia page at the time. No one had really heard of him outside of forensic circles. And so I essentially talked them into it. And when I was able to get into all this stuff, that's when I really realized what I had, which is what most authors want. So when you're writing a book like narrative nonfiction, which is what I write, particularly with historical crime, you want a lot of context. Like I want to be able to hold his glasses, which I did. I want to see all of the material that he collected. I want to read his journal, see what his handwriting looks like. He had so much stuff at him, like in the David Lamson case. He had pieces of blood spatter, and there was a maxi pad, which I know sounds really weird, but that was what the prosecutor said was what motivated David Lamson to kill his wife, was that she wasn't interested in having sex with him because she was on her period. And so he kept this maxi pad. I mean, it was just bizarre, the evidence that he had that he shouldn't have had. It should have been with the police, most likely. But I was able to look through all that. He had thousands of letters. I think I've read about 1,500 of his letters, thousands of pages of journals, 2,000 cases. And luckily the archivist was able to distill it down to, she said one time at the very beginning of this, I said, how am I going to figure out what cases to even use? And she laughed and she said, well, I started categorizing the violent versus non-violent cases And she said, I'm assuming you want the violent. And I said, yeah, I probably would want the violent. That's what we'll focus it on are the murders. And so, I was able to look at these cases and really narrow it down based on the thickness, on the amount of material that he collected. He was a photographer, so there were lots and lots of photographs, as you can see from the book, if you've seen the photographs in the book, and there are more on my website. He was a really good photographer, and so between the ephemera that was there, the bullets, he kept the most odd things. There was a woman who was run over by her own limousine 6 times. Somebody drove over her 6 times, and she had a locket with some hair around her neck. And he collected the locket. So he has this locket from this murder victim, and he was trying to find out who killed her. All of this stuff really gives me a lot of material to work with to build a world. I went to Berkeley. I drove to his house. I saw the house. It's still there. It's relatively the same. It's sort of, UC Berkeley, it's like all the houses to me are sort of up, sort of like New England. They're not out like in Texas. They're all sort of stacked. And so I could picture him when he was older. I say in the book, he had to build a railing down to the ground floor, the basement floor of his lab at his house because he had to work. And to me, that was just this visual of seeing this man in his 70s just slowly try to descend the stairs into his lab because he had to work, because he was still supporting his family, including his 2 sons, this whole time. So all of that was really important. It was an amazing experience to be with him and figure out his life and read his letters and see what his world was like. He seemed to have a nice marriage to Marion. I mean, they didn't seem to confide in each other with anything personal. He didn't talk to her about cases, at least in the letters, and he was gone a lot. So he wrote a lot of letters. That would have been their main way of communicating when they were not seeing each other in person. And I think they saw each other enough, but he was gone an awful lot. So he and Marion would just kind of gossip a little bit, but there was not a lot of case talk. He really reserved that for John Boynton Kaiser, who was the Watson character kind of in the book. He was the reference librarian. And when we talk about archives and how important they are, I lucked out, I think, because the people in Heinrich's circle were all innovators and important themselves. August Vollmer, who is the top cop he collaborates with, had his own archive at UC Berkeley because he taught at UC Berkeley. Oscar's son, Theodore, had a fantastic archive at a university in Canada because Theodore was a big deal in the theater museum world, big enough that people really wanted his archive. And so he kept all of his dad's letters. And Oscar kept all of Theodore's letters. So I don't have very much of Mortimer, the youngest son, but I have a lot from Theodore. I see a little pop-up here. It just caught my eye. I promise I won't do this again, about descendants. I wasn't able to locate any of his family. Theodore he was never married and never had any children. And Mortimer ended up in Hawaii, and I just didn't get very far trying to track down. Mortimer was long gone, and it seems like they had kids, but I was really having a hard time finding anybody. And I do that as a job with my podcast. I won't do a season of the show without being able to track down the family first, because I talk to the families in these historical stories. But I think when the book was being written, I just wasn't as adept with ancestry and with being able to track down people as I am now. So it's nice that, I'm with future books, I certainly know the tools to use to really be able to track people down, but I was not able to find any of his family. John Boynton Kaiser, I didn't know that the library world had, very famous big names, but it does. And he was a really big deal. So he had a huge collection, which was really nice. And there were, quite a lot of the forensic scientists that we refer to in the book. They all had collections, and everybody kept each other's letters. So I was able to kind of cross-reference these letters and create a conversation between these people. And that was really interesting. I've never really been able to do that before. With the first book, Death in the Air, there were a lot of conversations because three of the five or six characters were still alive. So I was able to, interview them and talk to them about what their experiences were. But the other people who were the characters had to appear through government memos in Death in the Air because the Ministry of Housing in London was blaming the Ministry of Health for all of this misinformation, and it kept going back and forth. So this was a nice, refreshing surprise dealing with letters and very, very personal issues with Oscar Heinrich and sort of who he was as a man, who he presented himself on the stand as, versus who he was privately with his friends. So it was a pretty remarkable experience, and I think forensics, just to wrap up and move on to the Q&A, I think forensics is so important now more than ever because, with this report that was released about 10 years ago by the National Academy of Sciences that talk about forensics and improvements that are needed and what we should or shouldn't be relying on, it just taught me an awful lot about tools that I thought were really reliable. And, if I hear about a case and saying, oh, yeah, the prosecutor is really depending heavily on fingerprint evidence or footprint, things that I really felt like were pretty strong in forensics, and it turns out they're not. So I think that has really informed me going forward about picking cases for the podcast or picking cases for future books. So he taught me a lot, and now I know a lot about air pollution, and I know a lot about forensic science. And my third book's I'm just finishing next week, my third book, and that's about the criminal mind and criminal psychiatry and psychology. So now I'm good with questions. Jamie, do you want them to yell out at will, or do you want to look in chat, or what would you like to do?
So right now we don't have anybody with a question in chat, and any of you that know me know that I can talk and ask lots of questions, but this is your opportunity to ask questions. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question, I'm sure this group seems small enough that we can do that without talking over each other. So I'm going to be quiet and let you all ask some questions. And if you're too shy to ask, and unmute yourself, by all means, you can put it in the chat and I will ask for you.
Okay. How long did you spend in the archives? That's a good question. So it depended. I went there several times, and the question was, how long did you spend in the archives researching the book? This was an unusual time for me. When I was doing Death in the Air, which was in London, I had it so well organized that I was in London for about 8 days in the archive. And I often hear about my friends who are retired authors, and they go and I think I have an image, this romantic image of them, and they go to an archive and they sit and they snap photos every once in a while and read through things. And it's very much this sort of long process. And they come home to the hotel and they drink scotch and smoke a cigar and read through the 3 or 4 items and amazing discoveries that they made that day. And that is not how I am in an archive. I have 2 kids and 3 jobs, and so I have to get in and get out. I do not have time to sit there and flip through and hope that I run across something. I am frantically taking photos with my cell phone, and then I just sort it out later. I don't care if it's a paper napkin that somebody accidentally stuffed into the archive. I just take a photo of it, and then I can always trash it later. So when I was in London, I was there for about 8 days. In Berkeley, it was a little bit of a different situation. I was really lucky. I've always been appreciative of archivists, but never more so than with this book, because Laura Michaels, who was the head archivist at UC Berkeley, is the one that took this project on. And she said, I'll give you an hour a week. I can do, no, it was a day a week of my 5 days. I'll go a day and I will go to this huge warehouse that they have and I'll pull down boxes and start to catalog it. And, when they catalog at an archive, they assign a carton number and a box number and a folder number. It's a pretty intense process. And then you have to write a description and you have to input it into the finding aid. So you're creating a list for people to be able to search. So she said, I can give you 1 day a week where I am going to go and take care of this. And it could take me a year to 2 years. And I said, well, this book is due in 2 years. What should I do in the meantime? The letters for Oscar were all available. So I was able, and they were just in chronological order. They weren't even cataloged by who sent them. So I would probably say I spent 5 days. The first trip to Berkeley from 8 a.m. when they opened until 6 or 7 p.m. whenever they closed, I would go in and I would, just photograph all of the letters, which is not ideal. That's not the way you really want to do it. But because they hadn't even really cataloged the letters yet, they were just in chronological order, I was just happy that they were able to give me the letters. So I figured out basically what my cases were. I asked Laura Michaels, tell me what your 10 to 15 best cases, the thickest cases are. She told me, because there was so much material in each one of the folders and so many letters and so much a trial transcript, I knew they were high profile. So I was able to find information without getting into his archive, just by knowing the cases that I wanted. And so I narrowed down the cases finally to the ones that are in the book. And then I was able to, in the year that she was cataloging all of his stuff, like his case files and his journals and everything, I was able to build the skeleton of the book using the letters and kind of cross. So I had his personal life in all of these letters. And I knew the cases that were going to span from 1920 to 1933. So I didn't photograph anything outside of those years. I was really taking a big snapshot of this man's life. I had some of his really early letters, and then I took some of his letters right before he died, like probably a 5-year span before he died. So then I spent that year really getting to know those cases that was available. So the David Lamson case at UC Berkeley was at Stanford. And there was an archive at Stanford. So I was able to pay to have somebody photograph, scan everything from Stanford about that case and send it to me. So then I was able to write that chapter. So this was not the way to write a book. It wasn't. It was so like piecemeal and in different sections and segments, but it was necessary because I had a deadline from my publisher, and at the same time, and I had to work on Laura Michaels' schedule also. So she actually, when she had was almost done cataloging everything that I could have possibly been interested in, she said, it was about 6 or 7 months before the book was due. She said, okay, you can come, and you can come straight to the warehouse. You don't even have to go to the library. So I showed up at the warehouse, and she just said, all the boxes are down there, which if you've ever been to an archive, they practically pat you down. You can't bring in anything, and you give them a slip with a box number, and they bring you one box at a time, and then you work with it, and then you give it back, and then you wait another 20 minutes, and you get another box, and it's a very long process. This was much faster because I was in the climate-controlled warehouse where all of his material had lived for more than 60 years, and nobody looked at it. So Laura asked if you go in blind and hope to come out with a plan. No, I never go in blind, thank goodness. I mean, finding aids are very helpful. So I'm doing research. I'm going to Massachusetts in about 3 weeks to do research on book number 4. And I have a good plan. They have some good finding aids in the archives where I'm going. I've asked them to, pull all the boxes beforehand. I know my schedule pretty well. I have to go to some cemeteries also while I'm there. I'm pretty good at planning out my schedule. But this was just a pretty extraordinary circumstance. I mean, normally I would be able to pull up a finding aid, see however many cases that he had, have a pretty good description of what each of those cases was, and then, I would be able to start going in and only pulling those boxes, and that was it. But instead, I when I went into Oscar's archive, I pulled those cases plus a few extra, which is really good. I can't really talk about the Netflix stuff because we haven't been able to officially announce it yet. But I was glad I went in and pulled the extra cases because we're going to need extra cases for this TV series. So it's a very stressful process, and I keep saying to myself, every time I go to an archive, well, I can always go back. But the reality is especially with COVID, you just never know. I'm going to be thrilled if these libraries are open in Massachusetts when I show up in 3 weeks. Because, and I also can't be away from my family that long. So I have to be really efficient when I do any of this. Um, yeah. So, book four. Well, Laura asked, what is book four about? Book four is, well, okay, hold on. Let's go back because I'm just turning in book three. So book three is about the subject of season one of my podcast, Tenfold More Wicked, which was about a man named Edward Ruloff. He was an expert in linguistics in the 1800s and brilliant, and also legitimately had psychopathy. I mean, he absolutely was a psychopath. He hits every marker you can think of for psychopathy. He killed 4 people in his own family and then went on to kill at least one other person, all in the name of philology, which was a subset of linguistics. And when he was finally caught after 30 years of terrorizing the countryside of upstate New York in the 1870s, after he was finally caught, he made an excellent case for having his life saved because he said he had a theory on the origin of human language that would revolutionize linguistics. And people believed it. Mark Twain said, don't kill him. Horace Greeley, who was running for president at the time, said, don't kill him. There were a lot of people who said this man is far too brilliant to be executed, even though he had killed some innocent people. So the third book is essentially, I talk about it in the podcast a little bit, but I don't go into depth about it. The third book is starts with a scene of Edward Ruloff, this genius killer that scared the daylights out of everybody because they just, in this time period in the 1800s, they just thought a killer looked rabid, like Henry Lee Lucas, like some really terrible looking person. And he was not. He was very Ted Bundy. So this was off-putting in the 1970s, when Ted Bundy was here, and it was much more off-putting in the 1800s with Edward Ruloff. So when he is shackled, awaiting execution and waiting for the governor to give him a pardon, groups of men come through just to figure out this guy. There's theologians, there's journalists, there's a lunacy committee full of alienists, there's a neurologist, and all of these people are trying to delve into the criminal mind. So the name of the book, my editor just sent it to me. It's a long title. So the name of the book is called All That Is Wicked. And the subtitle is something like A Gilded Age Tale of Murder, Mind Hunters, and the Race to find the blueprint of the criminal mind. So he was the sort of precursor to the Ted Bundy, who the FBI spent years interviewing Ted Bundy and other serial killers to try to figure out why they did what they did, why people with psychopathy act the way they do, or even just criminals. So I'm desperately trying to rack that up, and as soon as I get off this call with you, I will continue to try to write it. And then the fourth book, Laura asked what the fourth book is. That's actually, I'm super interested in this. So in the early, it was like 1820s, in sort of the industrial age in New England, all of these factories were popping up. And this is Jacksonian era. And these factories were popping up, and New England was becoming more industrialized. And they were hiring factory girls, is what they called them, who were young women, many of them coming off of farms, young women who would be cheap employment. And so when women were hired in these factories, the factory owners, who were largely Protestant, just promised the families that they would be safe. These young women would be safe in their care, that they would go to church, that this would be kind of a independence building, but not too independent because really their job was to get married to a nice man. But really the factory workers, the factory owners needed cheap labor and women were dependable. And so one of the workers who worked in Fall River, Massachusetts, which is where Lizzie Borden would be 50 years later, was a woman named Sarah Cornell. She came from a very well-to-do family in Connecticut, but had become troubled and had some brushes with the law. And she became a factory girl, they called them. And she took up with a Methodist minister. So what's so interesting is I did not realize that the Methodists were very controversial. I don't know a ton about religion, but in the 1800s, Methodists were very controversial. It was this newfangled religion. They had tent revivals. The ministers were frequently young and really good looking and very spirited. And this was opposed to the Protestant church, which was not. And she began an affair. Sarah Cornell began with an affair with a Methodist minister who was married with children. She got pregnant. He said, "I'm not marrying you." And she said, "I'm keeping the baby." And there's letters that say she figured out how much childcare would be. And she then the next thing that happens is she tells her sister in a letter that the Reverend wants to meet me. And on a farm, he wants to talk. And if I go missing, you need to look for Ephraim Avery, the Reverend in Fall River, Massachusetts. And she ends up the next day found hanging from a haystack pole, which is a pole they used to use to dry out hay. She was pregnant. It was made to look like a suicide, and it wasn't, of course. And he is on trial. One of the people who is watching this trial is a woman named Catherine Williams, who was from a very, very influential family and married into a very influential family in Rhode Island. And she was a poet. She was a single mom who was in a terrible marriage, which is incredible that she was a single mom in the 1800s, in the early 1800s. This is 1821. She was a single mother. And she supported herself solely from writing. She was an excellent writer, and she wrote a book called The Fall River Tragedy, a tragedy in Fall River, and it was about this case. And it was the very first advocacy true crime book, and it's pretty remarkable for a woman of her class to essentially come to the rescue of a woman of Sarah Cornell's class. And, all of I know I'm going on and on about this book, but it's so important. And it looks like there, are quite a few women in this group because in true crime, we use women oftentimes in true crime as a plot device. I mean, they are the bodies, and we are many times more fascinated with the killer than with the victim. And, Catherine Williams just destroyed the Reverend's reputation with this book. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, and she does an excellent job just deconstructing the entire crime. He is acquitted. He is totally acquitted, and it causes outrage because it has become a fight between two megachurches, the Protestants and the Methodists. And the Methodists were literally tarred and feathered in New England in the early 1800s. I mean, they wanted they wanted them out. So this was a real touchstone for religion in the time period. And Catherine Williams she is this just crusading true crime writer. She doesn't go as far as saying, Sarah Cornell is completely innocent, because I think that would have been a little over the top for the 1800s. She essentially said, listen, probably not a good idea having an affair with a married minister, but she really, it's a very sort of strong feminist move, and it drives Ephraim Avery out of New England forever. and sort of destroys his life. So the book is going to be interesting for me to write. It's going to be me as a true crime writer, not a memoir. I'm not interested in doing a memoir of myself, but I love the idea when I talked to my editor about this. I love the idea of sort of working with Catherine Williams, gathering information. She has information in the 1800s and interviews that I could never access. I mean, she was there in person interviewing people. And I have access to family members that she was never able to access. So, into records that she could never get her hands on. So I'm trying to figure out how this is going to work as a book, but it's really exciting to think as a female true crime writer in, 2021 working on a book with the research of a contemporary 1822 true crime writer who herself came from such an incredible background and her struggles, and it's clear why she was so adamant about defending Sarah Cornell, because it could have been her too, even though she came from this incredibly wealthy family. She really anyway. I love that book. It's a very special. I love all my books, but that's a very special place for me. So, okay, let's see. Sorry, Laura, that was a very long answer. Kit from Roanoke, thank you. Kit from Roanoke asked, have you ever been interested in becoming an archivist yourself and the other side of the process? I am not smart enough, for sure, to be an archivist. It is fascinating. So the thing that I think I saw in Laura, the archivist at Berkeley, that I had never seen because I had never gotten to know an archivist really before. I mean, they're just more helpful than anything else. But I really sat with her to a point where we would sit at the table, and I picked up a tuft of hair one time that had a bow around it, and it didn't belong to a box. It had fallen out, and I picked it up and I looked at her and I said, whose hair is this? And she said, is it blonde? And I said, yeah. And she goes, oh, that's Virginia Rapay. That's her hair, who was the victim in the Fatty Arbuckle case. So I had this woman's hair, but the only person who knows Heinrich as well as I do is Laura Michaels, because she read through all of that stuff. And it was so interesting. I still kind of, like when I found out about his dad's death, it was 3 a.m. I emailed her the article and I said, did you know this? And she emailed me back 2 hours later. She's like, no, I didn't know this. I said, it's amazing. So I have so much respect for them. And I will tell you, and librarians, I will tell you that I think Laura, the reason that she was so helpful is that she works so hard to catalog these collections that sometimes people don't look at and don't use. And I told her, this is a real public. I'm with Penguin Random House. I'm a real writer. If I tell you I'm going to be there, this book will be read widely. I will tell everybody about you. I talked about her on NPR, that this was a really special book that I could not have done had this archivist not said, okay, let's do it. I believe that you're going to do this, and I will spend the next year and a half, away from other collections to deal with this. So no, Kit, I don't want to do I don't want to be an archivist because I've seen how hard and laborious it is, and I feel like my job is a little easier. I mean, a lot easier in some ways. But I am so grateful for every one of them now. I'm so grateful for it. So, what was the most interesting thing in the Heinrich archive that you couldn't find a way to include in the narrative of the book? It was a case. So I'll tell you guys about the case because it'll probably pop up on the Netflix series, but it's one of my favorite cases, and I had sort of read about it, but when I looked at the file, I thought this is great, but there was nowhere to put it in the book, and in a minute you'll know why. So in the book, one of the things that's important, I think when I tell my students at UT about designing a documentary film, I'm looking at the narrative arc, right? So you set the stakes early in the book. Why do I care about Oscar Heinrich? He came from a really hard background. He's a hard scrabble guy. He is trying to make a difference. He's got these 2 kids who depend on him. And so by the time you get to the arc, is he going to fail or is he going to succeed? You care what happens to this guy. And then what's the aftermath? Does he succeed? Is he humiliated by Chauncey McGovern on the stand? Like, what happens to his career? after the debacle of Fatty Arbuckle, and he's humiliated. So within each of these chapters is its own little narrative arc, because I have a case I have to deal with and other people. It's not just Oscar. And so I wanted to make sure that each of the cases that I picked had significance, not only in his life, but in forensics. So as we move along, you'll notice that there's kind of one area of forensics that we tackle. So the first one, Father Husland, is like the sand and profiling, the handwriting analysis, and then the Fatty Arbuckle is fingerprinting, and then, Siskiyou train robbery is trace evidence, which is everything that he could find on those overalls, and so on. So this case that I love so much doesn't fit in anywhere. There's no major forensic tool that he used or anything innovative. It's just a cool case. So I'll tell you the case. And some of you might have heard of it. I don't know. So there was a man named Carroll Raeblin who, in World War I, was a soldier, a really good soldier. A bomb went off, and he became hearing impaired completely. He came back to California. He was from California. He wanted to get married. He was having a hard time getting married, even though he had like a pension, and he had he had money, and his family had money. So he took out an ad, and a woman replied from Texas. He brought her out from Texas, and her name was Eva Raeblin. And Eva was attractive. She seemed to be a really good wife. And the problem was that Eva liked to go dancing, and Carroll did not because of his hearing. But he wanted her to be happy. So he would take her to dances every other week, Friday night. She and her girlfriends would get together. They would go to one of these community hop dances in California, Central California. And he would sit in the car outside, and she would bring him coffee and cookies, and she would dance, and then that would be it. And then they would sort of move on with their week. So this happened one night. She came out, she brought him a cup of coffee and some cookies, and he drank it, and within about 30 seconds, he was choking, and then he died. And she screamed, she called the police, everybody came running. And eventually a toxicology report, not by Heinrich, but a toxicology report came out and said he died from strychnine poisoning. And who hired Heinrich was Carroll Raeblin's father, who hated his daughter-in-law, hated her. He thought she was a gold digger, and he did not think she was a very good wife. And he said, I think that she killed him because of, it's strychnine. How else is this going to happen? So the problem was that Eva said that that Carroll had been suicidal, that he was depressed over his hearing impairment. It was a nightmare for him. And there was really no way to prove that he had not done it himself. That would not, incidentally, be the best way to do it. It certainly is a very painful death, but there was literally, there was no way to determine that when she handed him the cup, that he didn't pour it in himself and drink it. It was found in the cup, it was found in his body, and that was it. And no one saw her put anything into a cup. So Heinrich went through, and they found a receipt that she had bought for strychnine, and they identified the woman as Eva Raeblin. And Eva said, yeah, I bought it for the rats, which is what a lot of people did. And it was legal to buy it. So again, no proof. So he goes back and he decides he wants to talk to some of the party goers. So he re-interviews everybody. Even the cops have already interviewed. It was like 40 people jammed into this place. And he asked somebody, tell me, set the scene. What does this look like? And they said, okay, well, the little coffee hutch place where you can get the coffee and the cookies is over here. There's the dance floor. Here's the door for her to get out. So he said, what does the dance floor look like? And they said, packed. And he said, there is no way she could have gotten coffee and cookies, walked all the way, even if she walked on the edge, and not bumped into someone and spilled that coffee. So he re-interviewed everybody. And he found a woman who said, yeah, she spilled coffee on me. It was on my dress. I didn't wash the dress. Here's the dress. And he tested it and had strychnine in it. And she confessed. So that's a great case. but it's not forensically anything. It's just that would have never occurred to me. Maybe it would have occurred to you all, but again, I'm not as smart. I mean, I don't think I would have come up with that. And I was supremely impressed with that he came up with that. And it was a precedent. This was in 1926 is when this happened. It set a precedent when people read about that case, that when criminals would see his name on the docket as a witness for the prosecution, they would just confess because of that case, because he just sort of figured it out. There was nothing unique about it. It was just toxicology. He had done it a million times, and that was it. So I love that case. It's one of my favorite cases. So that is probably the most interesting narrative and thing. Evan asked that, and the most interesting thing I couldn't put in the book, but that I love so much. What was the first murder crime case that captivated your attention? Jamie wants to know, and lead you down the path of becoming a true crime writer. I think, I don't know, it's hard to remember. My mom was a clinical psychologist, and she read everything In Cold Blood and all of the fiction stuff and a lot of nonfiction. She's a huge, huge, huge true crime fan. I sometimes talk about her on Wicked Words when I interview people on one of the podcasts, because she'll always comment on, different podcasts. The first case that I was really, really involved in that I thought was interesting was as a news producer, and it was the Chandra Levy case, which I bet some of you guys remember. So this happened 3 months before September 11th happened. And it happened over the summer, and I think it was about 3 months. It happened over the summer before September 11th. Chandra Levy was an intern, a congressional intern, and she worked for a congressman named Gary Condit. And he was a Republican or Democrat maybe, from Central California. And he was married with kids. His wife had a terminal disease, and she went missing. Young woman went missing, Chandra Levy. She was 20 or something. And it sounded like her friends said that she and Gary Condit were having an affair. He would not talk to the police, and he would not admit to it. And he was under suspicion and ended up either resigning or losing his seat because he wouldn't talk about it because he was married. And then her body had not been found, and it was just pure torture for her family. And I was in Modesto, where she was from and where Gary was from, for about 3 months, just reporting on it nonstop. I mean, to a point where one of the reporters we were doing a live shot at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and one of the anchors of the network said to my reporter, "So what's happening there, John?" And he said, "Absolutely nothing," because it was such a big story. They still wanted us on nonstop. The only thing that got us out of that was what happened with September 11th. And so Gary Condit resigned, I think. I can't remember if he resigned or if he just lost his seat, but it was a terrible scandal for him. And it turned out he didn't do it. A serial killer got her. She was jogging in the park in Washington, D.C., and he killed her and buried her there, along with, I think, a couple of other women. And this just came out a few years ago. So I found that story so fascinating because he just he preferred being a murder suspect to admitting to having an affair, So I think that was really the first story that made me sort of have an interest in it, in that true crime is interesting because for me, it is so much about the victim and getting to know the victim's family. And it was really difficult for me because we had to have a live truck in front of the Levy's house in Modesto. And we eventually moved it. I finally said, we have to move it because this family is grieving. And it just really taught me how invasive crime reporting could be. And I just decided I wanted to do something different. I didn't want to do that kind of crime reporting anymore. I wanted to try something different. So aside from the maxi pad, what are some of the crazy pieces of forensic evidence you've heard being collected and used to solve a case? He had, Heinrich had the oddest things. He had bomb parts. He had a man had been stabbed in the heart, and he had taken a wax imprint of the of the stab mark in the heart, and he had this wax. I have no idea what he thought he was going to do with this. He had a lot of really interesting, I think, pieces of evidence. I think probably the bullet, I got to see the bullets that played such a big part. There's a case in the middle of the book, the Martin Caldwell case, which is sort of a ho-hum case. If we were in Britain, they would call it a fish and chips case. It's just a standard, an employee shoots his former employer, but it was a really pivotal case for with Heinrich, because that's when he invented this procedure for photographing two bullets under the same microscope and how you could compare them. And they sort of accused him of 1920s photoshopping. And he was able to prove it right then and there that that's not what the case was. So the bullets that were there in the archive, I thought were really fascinating to see those bullets and the striations, the markings, and how they matched. And just see I love looking at the photographs that he has of himself with this camera device and how he was able to use it effectively, and it's something that they still use. And, one last thing really about Heinrich, people always ask me, what do you think his legacy was? And it's sort of partially boring. He didn't invent bloodstain pattern analysis. He didn't invent ballistics. There were people who came before him and came after him who did a lot of that work. Heinrich did two things, both very importantly. One, because I think he was OCD for sure, he created a way of collecting evidence and cataloging it and saving it that was really remarkable and unusual. And, when I look at his notes in his journal on the Fatty Arbuckle case, he would mark like the longitude and latitude of feathers found in Fatty Arbuckle's suite. Like, he really, really went over everything, and he cataloged it, and he wrote it down, and he kept all of the evidence in special containers. He knew exactly where everything was. So there was that part. But then you have that information when you die. What happens to that information? It's great. It's good for you as a forensic scientist to know how to do this stuff. But he was a professor, and he taught for more than 20 to 30 years, and he taught people how to use all of those techniques. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I love to teach is, you have this knowledge and you get to disseminate it, and people then hopefully disseminate it to other people. And hopefully, if your techniques are good and your information's good, you are then influencing a wide variety of people. And so Heinrich's legacy to me is that of a teacher. He really, really affected students. And it started out with the cop college, where it was just police officers. And then by the end, he was teaching lay people, whoever wanted to take his criminology classes. So it's not like some tool that he invented that we still use, but it is a legacy nonetheless that I think to me is very impressive. So, chain of custody. Yeah. I mean, and that is important now. Laura's pointing that out, that the chain of custody and keeping the evidence, and being able to say, this is where it was, this is how it was collected. He photographed everything ad nauseum. I mean, unbelievably. So I really, when I saw the archive, I have a child who has OCD, and I probably have a skosh of OCD too. And I just immediately, when I saw the archive, it just was everywhere. The way that he collected things, the way they were organized, and it all just made sense. But, we didn't really get to talk about this, but, the part of that also is the maddening part of it, which we find out with people I know who have it and my child who has it, is that, I was so joyous when I looked at this archive, because there was so much there. He kept all of this, and it was so well organized, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. And, he cataloged it and described it, and there were no questions. And then I looked at Laura pointed to these stacks of leather-bound journals, and there were probably 20 of them, 30 of them maybe. And I opened them up, and it was, and I say this in the book, and it was an incredible detailed account of every penny he ever spent. And I just and not in a organized, this is what I want to teach my kids how to balance a checkbook kind of way, in a obsessive, taking up energy and time, and he was constantly on the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, it's just was, it's painful for me. It's painful to look at all those journals because, I know the amount of time he had, which was not much. I know that the misery that his father's death put him through and the fear that it made him feel. And until I found out about his father's death, I didn't really put together this journal and his obsession with trying to keep a track of his money and not doing a good job with it. I just couldn't put it all together where that fear was coming from. But knowing what happened with his father and why it happened, I think was pretty telling for me. So anyway, Oscar Heinrich was a fascinating person, and it was an amazing experience. It was a big gift for me. So I appreciate you all having me. This has been a wonderful experience. I know it's 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock y'all's time, 6 o'clock my time. Um, so I really appreciate you having me.
Well, we really appreciate you coming and spending your afternoon with us. This is a fascinating topic. Again, everybody, if you have not read her other books, please do so. We've got them in the system. Check out her podcast. As a true crime fanatic, this is a really great podcast. I listen to it all the time.
Thank you.
And we are going to continue this conversation next Thursday at 6 p.m. We're working with the Commonwealth Attorney Office to present forensic evidence in court. And so you'll have your opportunity to talk with actual prosecutors in Botetourt County about how they use forensic evidence in their cases. So please go to our website, bocolibraries.info, and register for the event, and we'll send you out a link just like we did today, and you can join us then. And thank you guys so much for joining us, and thank you again, Kate.